The BBC isn't as biased as, say, Kim Jong-un's media. It's not as biased as Russian state media, but it is biased. And it is biased in terms of Brexit. I know that, having stood for election and been one of the sole Brexiteers on a BBC panel endlessly, I was against 3 or 4 people. Now, you could say
you
that...
You bullied Martin.
I gave as good as I got. And in fact, it may be a great debater. But the fact of the matter is that's not necessarily because the BBC is inherently biased. It's because it reflected the political class who were biased. Because the political class was 2/3 Remain, 1/3 Brexit. And therefore, the guests reflected that. So the BBC were replicating an inbuilt bias into our political class. Therefore, the media was intrinsically biased. The BBC is very biased on things like NHS pay strikes. When would they ever criticise the NHS? When would they put an alternative view across to climate change or net zero taxes? When would they challenge things like racism being a fact of British culture? They do churn out biased news, just like Channel 4, or just like ITV, or just like, say, Sky News. But of course, the difference is we have to pay for this, and if we don't, we can go to jail. So that's the point. The BBC, I think, has problems with bias, and they replicate an endless story, I think, of division, politically, socially, identity politics, racism, sexism, slavery. The BBC tells us all the time that Britain is bad. Britain used to be celebrated by the British Broadcasting Company. It no longer is. And actually, look on the bright side, that's why GB News exists.
Well, there you go. There is space for us all. But Joe, for me,
David Attenborough's Wild Isles is a celebration of Britain.
It's a propaganda vehicle for the world's going to die because of climate change.
You can't have it both ways.
It's unwatchable.
It's an absolute,
depressing
paean to nature in these islands.
OK, well, take another data set. People put these together to show BBC bias. For example, the BBC dedicates far more programming to the discussion of inequality rather than, say, the promotion of economic growth or reducing the deficit in the past. Do you think those editorial choices are without a bias?
I think it's very difficult when you work in a large media organisation, and I think, it is probably true to say that a large proportion of journalists, particularly in London, do reflect a certain viewpoint. And I think that's something that the BBC is very well aware of and has tried to address, not always entirely successfully. But I think there is an element of truth in what Martin says, that it reflects the people around. In the same way that GB News does, actually. That you're reflecting your viewers' views, by and large. But I do think it's really important to say that it is, to the point, I think, sometimes of its own navel-gazing, trying to get the balance right, and they are much more timid now and frightened because the licence fee is under threat.